We're recording.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the February 25th, 2021 meeting of the Ad Hoc Ethics Code Review Committee. Is there a motion to open the meeting?
I make a motion to open the meeting.
Second. All in favor, signify.
Aye.
The motion is carried. The meeting is open. The first order of business is discussion and approval of the minutes of the meeting of February 11th. Has everyone had a chance to now review them? Are there any comments regarding those minutes? If there are no comments, then is there a motion to approve those minutes?
I make a motion to approve.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion on the motion? If no discussion, all in favor, please signify.
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The motion is carried. The minutes of February 11th, 2021 are approved. Is there a motion to approve the minutes of February 18th, 2021?
To be honest, I have not reviewed them yet. I've been on all the budget stuff.
Okay. I don't want a discussion or vote unless everyone has reviewed those minutes. So let's, without objection, defer discussion and review of those minutes to the next meeting of the committee. I'm going to, well, I thought I put that on the agenda, but what I would like to do is discuss a meeting date for next week. I have a conflict which I cannot change. And I am mindful that there are, I guess, some other village meetings that Nora may be obliged to attend. Nora, if you're still with us, what are the dates that would conflict with a village meeting?
Next week we have.
Can you speak up, Nora?
Yeah, next week we have a lot of meetings. I'm just trying to pull up the calendar.
And what is it, Tuesday and Wednesday we have budget meetings, Nora?
Yeah, so there are budget meetings Tuesday from 5 to 7:30. Monday from 5 to 7:30. I don't see one on Tuesday, but I thought we had one. And then I have an arts council meeting that I have to run at 7:30 on Monday. I don't think we don't have budget again till Wednesday.
Okay.
So what, I'm sorry, I lost a little bit of that. What dates are not good, or is March 1st, 2nd, and 3rd all not? I'm sorry, my meeting is the 4th. So
right.
1st, 2nd, and 3rd, are those blocked out because of village meetings and other responsibilities?
Yeah, they are.
All right. So I think we're going to have to, unless we can meet, I don't want to inconvenience anybody's workday. So I think what we're talking about is a 2-week break, unless someone has another idea. All right, so for now, we will not be meeting on March 4th, and we will be reconvening on March 11th.
Okay, and I'll make sure Sally knows.
Thank you.
How Sally stays on top of all of this is beyond me. Just sideline comment.
She's very organized, that Sally.
She's phenomenal.
Okay. Next, Brian, do we have anybody else attending the meeting? Is there anybody who's besides members of the committee and Nora?
No, but there's 2 John Hofstetters.
Oh boy.
Did everyone see that? Now it just went away.
Yeah, no, I tried to I'm having some computer problems with every Thursday my computer updates, and every Thursday I have a problem getting onto a Zoom meeting. So I apologize.
No worries. You only get one vote, though.
At least you don't freeze every 2 minutes, John.
Okay, I'd like to go to the, well, Nora, do we have any joy regarding the
Yes.
mailing of
Yes,
our
the
letter to
village is
the
gonna send-
village employees at large?
Yeah, the village is gonna send the language.
Nora, I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Why? Hold on, let me,
It could be me.
You can play with your audio settings if you want
I hear everybody except Nora.
yeah. No, I mean, that's what I mean for Nora. Sometimes the mics, you can adjust your mic.
is that better?
I can make you out.
Okay, I don't know, I have my output volume pretty loud. Okay, anyway, yes, so the village, yes, it's the language that we sent to Jerry, I guess about 2 or 3 weeks ago, is the language that will go out to all village employees.
When?
I think it'll go out, maybe tomorrow, or it'll go out through Power DMS. Have you all signed up for that?
Yes.
Yes.
And then that way, they can tell who's seen it and who hasn't seen it.
Perfect.
Well,
So they're
thank you for that, Nora.
They're trying to make everything go out through Power DMS, so if if somebody misses an email, they can go check their Power DMS account. But I do think it's a little, we're all getting used to it. But anyway, but you're welcome. You're welcome.
So Nora, I have a question on that. Just as a sideline, which impacts other stuff. Does every employee have access to Power DMS?
Yeah, all the employees and all the volunteers.
Excellent. Okay.
In fact, that's how the ethics code went out this year.
Right.
Yes, I know.
That's great. That's
Can I just ask one thing? Nora, I'm sorry, I think you may have said earlier. Is it the letter that we've drafted is going out? Or is it
The letter
somebody
that you
else's letter?
The letter that you drafted is going to go out.
Okay, thank you.
It's the one that I sent to Jerry maybe 3 weeks ago now.
So we should all see it, actually.
You know what? I'll pull it up and send it to you all now.
But as volunteers, we should also be getting a copy.
Exactly. So that's a good way to verify that it went out.
Yep. Okay.
okay. Great news. At least, assuming it does go out, we have at least made the record that we communicated with the constituent group most affected probably by this code of ethics that we are examining. So another item which I don't think, darn, I didn't put it on the agenda. I don't think was the issue involving, I emailed you guys on it. What was it? Well, let's go to annual distribution of the code of ethics, which Ellen, I believe you requested we put on the agenda.
Yes. So
Let's
if you
do that.
go to that section in the code, please.
Yes. 21-5. There we are.
All right. So it doesn't really say anything about timing. So the code of ethics is distributed once a year. I think we should say every January, every February, pick a month, it doesn't matter. And give everyone X to be discussed, amount of time to make sure they've read it. And then what's the follow-up if they haven't read it?
The annual organization meeting is in December. So maybe it should coincide with that.
Well, I was kind of thinking the first week in January, start the new year.
Yeah, but I mean, from a perspective of the new board starts whatever, the first week in January, first week in December.
December, yeah.
So if you haven't completed it by the first week in January, then
Okay, that's fair, except you've got the holidays in the middle, but I hear where you're coming from. You've got new board members, new potential board of trustees.
yeah.
Yep,
The
it
only-
needs to be issued immediately. So I'm cool with that, with right after the organization meeting. But this is just kind of, so we issue it and we walk away. You know, there's no follow-up. And what made me focus on this was in September, through DMS, we all got the training for sexual harassment, not how to sexually harass, but and a follow-up came out to everybody, whether you took the class or not. So I have an issue with that. In February, early February, please make sure you've taken the course. So from September to February, there was no chasing, no follow-up, and it was a generic follow-up to everybody. So I think we need to be very specific here.
What's the goal? And what is your objective on this, Ellen? And how do we change it to meet that objective?
To me, I think we need to put it,
Did she freeze? I think while she's coming back, I would think we want, we want them to affirm receipt.
yep,
So A, they got it. We want to make, well, our overall goal is that every employee is aware of the code of ethics and at least affirms or signs that they've read it, with our hopes that they have, right? So that's the goal. And has an opportunity to ask questions for things that aren't clear or they don't understand. So that's what I would think. Ellen, sorry, you froze, so I just filled in.
no, that's fine. We're pretty much on the same page, coming out of financial institutions that track all this stuff, but I don't think we can leave this open-ended, that, you know, we've sent it out and we hope people read it. I think we need to ensure people do read it.
So,
And first point you made, Dan, was about the timing. On an annual basis, the code of ethics shall be distributed, something around the timing. And if we know the timing, let's add that.
Right, so I think John had a great idea right after the organization meeting in early December.
Can I just say one thing on the timing? And I think it's
Sure.
a good time. Doesn't the ethics board issue a report on an annual basis? And seeing how this is, we want them to read this, would it be appropriate for the ethics board to recognize that X number of people have received and acknowledged this and possibly include it in their report? And if we did it around that timing, meaning the annual report, might that be a good time? And I don't want to put something on the ethics board to have to do, but possibly the staff, and I know somebody else has to do this, but the staff could certify to the board, this mailing went out on this day. 45 days later, we have certified that they have all acknowledged receiving this and their responsibility to be aware of the contents of it.
Well,
I think that's fine, except I think where John does have a valid point is in the first week in December, new committee members are assigned, new board members are assigned, et cetera, et cetera. So we could potentially end up with a split. All new appointees have to do this in December. Everybody else might be a different timeline. I don't know.
I would just think the annual meeting is December, so everybody should fill it out between December, whatever time, whatever the date of the annual meeting in December, give it a month from that annual meeting, and you've got to have it completed by the end of the month.
Yeah,
Yep.
I make a motion if that's what the committee wants to do. And that's a good time we could recommend.
And
I think you're talking about two things. One is, so Sally sends the disclosure forms, and they have to get back, March. They have to get back by mid-February. So the ethics board and Sally track those down and remind people. So that's mid-February. When the ethics board hasn't been doing reports, but they did they do the report in December. So their report's sort of like done at the end of the year.
right.
If they keep on the schedule. So it would be at the end of the year people have served, not the beginning.
But the ethics board could theoretically say at the end of the
Prior year.
end of the at the end
Right.
of the year following. So basically December, the notification goes out and people are expected to affirm that they have seen it and read it. They have a month to do that. And then the ethics board can, at the end of the year, when they do a tally up, how many people completed it within a month? How many people completed it within 2 months? And how many completed it within the year? And just leave it at that. And, the reality is, if people haven't completed it within a month, it's a liability issue for the village.
Well, that's my next point. So once we agree on whatever that time frame is, whether it's a month, whether it's 2 months, whatever it is, what's the ramification?
How many employees does the Village of Mamaroneck have?
150, 160, I think, John, right?
Yeah, I think that's about right.
And so probably that number of volunteers too.
Right.
I kind of think that this is something, maybe we would want to inquire with the village manager, the assistant manager, and let's get their opinion as to how long they think it's appropriate, given each employee's work and how long they
Yeah,
think and what.
Yeah, but Mike,
I kind of agree
sorry.
with Mike on this, but I also have to say, it's not our parameter to decide what the punishment is. It's just the process and what is a good process. And I personally think, either this is an important thing that we are asking the employees and the volunteers to do, or it's not. And if it's not an important thing, then why are we doing this? And if it is an important thing, there has to be if we're not viewing this, if the village doesn't view this as an important thing, there's no reason to go through this process.
Right. We're setting the policy, and the expectation is if our recommendations are adopted, that they will be upheld and I think monitored. I think that's a whole nother issue, but that's not, we're setting the policy and the standards. I
And
don't think we have the role to say what if they don't. I don't think that's in our scope. Our hope is that if they're adopted.
Well, we
Except
can point out
where
to the
I-
board. Sorry, go
where
ahead,
I-
Ellen. Sorry.
I'm sorry, where I disagree with you, Jocelyn, and I think with you, John, as well, is, have I frozen again?
No,
You're
here.
good, you're good, you're good.
Okay, my screen froze. So, in other areas, we're saying that if you don't do ABC, you could be suspended, you could have a fine. To me, if we don't put something in, and maybe it's a vague word, which I hate.
Well, she froze now.
It's a vague word. I don't know what do we think the vague word is? I don't know.
Function.
Could be suspended, could be,
suspended.
right.
Let me,
To put some more meat behind this.
I just want to share a view on this. I am all in on the threshold question of distributing the code and making sure that employees affirm that they received it and affirm that they understand it, because I think we do have there should be a presumption that employees are familiar with the code and know when they violated it.
Yep.
Where I depart is, from my own experience, you will get a high level of tardy compliance on this in the workforce at every level. And this is where I feel it is more benign than failure to file a disclosure form. I am concerned about imposing upon this duty a penalty upon somebody who collects trash, cleans up the park, polices our streets. I would rather have the village manager chase them, but
Agreed.
I am concerned about automatic penalties on people who have this duty.
Dan, I couldn't agree more. And having been responsible at various levels for ensuring people adhere and do this, I think we should leave this to the manager and inquire with him and say, what do you feel is the best way to get compliance? And let them track them down and say, hey, have you read this? You have to reply back to us.
I'm fine with that, with one codicil. It can't be several months later that they say, oh, let's chase people.
Agree.
Because what the message there is, it's not important to me either. Like the sexual harassment training, to go from September to February to chase is horrible.
I agree. And that's where I think the Board of Ethics, including this as part of their annual report, that the entire village workforce and volunteers are in compliance with section 21-5 as it pertains to receipt and review.
Yeah, there is going to be, and there is just going to be a high level of non-compliance, and is that in my own experience, it's at every level, and it's just a high percentage. And what you do is you wrangle people, you chase them.
Listen, whether it's 50% compliance or it's 5% compliance or 100, I just think it's important that this is included in the report so that the public has an understanding, what is the knowledge of these rules, right? And, the board would ultimately determine whether it's an acceptable level or not and direct the village management staff to proceed appropriately.
All right, so I'm fine with no punishment, for lack of a better word. But we do need to make sure this is chased regularly.
Well, I mean, maybe we can make a recommendation that a month after the annual meeting, the village manager makes a report to the Board of Trustees of maybe the numbers of people that have not responded. You don't want to create an environment where people are singled out unfairly or singled out, publicly. You want compliance as best you can get it.
I'm fine with that. One of the things that NatWest Markets, where I used to work, did, when we had to do, I don't know, it was a whole variety of things they would do this for. Your manager would get a report. 8 out of 10 people haven't done this, so, you got called out numbers, so if nothing else, your manager got embarrassed from a senior manager perspective if the stats were wrong. So your immediate manager would just make sure everybody did whatever they had to do. And maybe that's the way we do it.
I can work with this. Let me see if I can redraft this section in such a way that we engineer something to get the code distributed, acknowledged, complied with, but without mandatory penalties. Let me work with that.
And it just becomes more of a statistical thing.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
I'm
Can I
okay
just
with,
add one thing?
Go.
And just to be consistent, I mean, we wanted the manager to send out this notice for many months and it didn't happen. I think that this is something that we should at least have the chairman send the manager an email and say, okay, what do you think? You know what I mean? And let's get his firsthand opinion on this because he's ultimately going to have to carry this out.
so can I make a different suggestion, Mike? We've shifted throughout all of this, a lot of the responsibilities to Jerry, the village manager, or to the clerk treasurer's office. Maybe we have them attend a meeting with us and go over what we think we should be doing, not just this item, but across the board.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
But I will say, this process of doing it electronically should simplify things
Yeah.
Absolutely.
in a major.
But I do think if we don't have Jerry's buy-in on a lot of this, we're not going to go anywhere.
My opinion is it's really not about Jerry's buy-in. It's about Board of Trustees buy-in. The Board of
Except
Trustees-
the Board of
don't
Trustees,
buy in, Jerry doesn't have to worry about it.
except the Board of Trustees will also be asking Jerry what his thoughts are. And they'll take his opinion into account. So I think, if we can make it so it works for everybody, including us, without dumbing down our recommendations, I think that's the best way to go.
Okay. Anything more on this? Because I think we're at a kind of a consensus, and I think the next step would be is if I can work on a draft of this and send it to everybody, we can have another discussion at the next meeting.
Yeah, I just had a question about the last section in A, the last sentence in A, sorry. The Code of Ethics statute must be posted in each public building. So we're gonna have like a 20-page document just posted everywhere.
No. The state has a poster that summarizes things so you can get it from New York State.
All right, could we just make that clear, like the New York State Code of Ethics statute?
Or the New York State poster
Okay.
is what it is that gets posted.
All right, because when we say like Code of Ethics, I automatically assume village.
It's not the whole 18-page, 20-page document, no. Or in very teeny print that
It
no
doesn't
one
say like
can
it's
read.
can be accessed at the village office or something like that.
No, the state mandate is that this be posted.
That what be posted?
That the Code of Ethics must be posted in public buildings. That's a state mandate.
Yeah, but you're talking about the VOM code that must be posted?
No. There's a poster you could get from the state that has to be posted in every building.
But the-
That's got this in like microscopic print that,
No, it's a summary poster.
The Code of Ethics statute.
Yep.
The New York State Code.
All right,
Yep.
so that's what has to be,
all
we
right,
may have to clarify that.
That's
what it
fine.
is that's going to be posted. So that's a very good catch by Brian. Okay, so let's I'd like to go back up and go to the order I suggested in the notes that I sent out. And we're in 21.3, business entity. And what I've done there is I transposed a clause because as it was originally written, it suggested that the $5,000 a year applied to a not-for-profit entity. In other words, it was worded, the $5,000 captured everything in the paragraph. And I think what the intent of the statute is to provide that the $5,000 applied to a real business, a corporate entity, so to speak, and that alternatively, or a not-for-profit entity from which ordinarily you wouldn't be making that money. Am I clear on that? Silence indicates, no, I'm not being clear, or silence indicates that I am being clear.
I don't completely understand your point.
Okay. The way the code was originally written, bear with me a second. Under business entity, it said a corporation, limited liability corporation, partnership, sole proprietorship, or other registered business of which a village officer or employee is a member, partner, owner, director, or employee, or a not-for-profit entity for which a village officer or employee receives compensation of more than $5,000 a year. And that section applies to conflicts of interest. So my assumption was that the drafters did not intend to provide a not-for-profit entity for which a village officer or employee receives compensation of more than $5,000 a year. I thought it applied, the $5,000 a year applied to where you work for, where you work for a living, or an actual ongoing business, and that because if it applied to a not-for-profit entity for which a village employee earned more than $5,000 a year, I would assume that if you volunteered for a not-for-profit entity, you could escape that restriction, or perhaps that was the intention
Okay.
of the
I see what
drafter.
you're saying. So you're proposing more restrictive language.
I am, because you could be.
Yeah, no, I understand.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I was presuming that that was the intent. If it's not the intent, or the committee believes that the not-for-profit entity should be put back up and rank with the other for-profit businesses, we'll leave it the way it is.
I understand your point completely, and I think it clarifies things.
Is there a view on that? Give it some thought. We can pick it up again at the next meeting, but that's where I was going. Let's move on. 21, the definition of village consultant. Now, in our last meeting, I suggested deleting the word village because the word is used interchangeably through the code. And I've given you an example of that in the notes, where under, for example, 21.4N, that's not, is that where I want to be? Sorry. Yeah. Well, the clause where I'm going is in Let me just. Here, declaration of policy. The board recognizes that it must establish high standards of ethical conduct. It is the purpose of this chapter to afford officers. Darn, where is it? No, that's not, I'm sorry. I'm looking for. Bear with me a second, I'm sorry. Here. Here is a reference to consultants, which is not, does not take in, is not defined, and there are other parts, I believe, in the code which refer to consultants, but the code separately defines village consultant, and the whole point of this is to retain the definition as it appears in the code, but to make sure that it's consistent in its use. And so what I would do probably is address this issue where it is used without definition, or it's used in a, you'd have to define consultant in a way that that was consistent. Sorry if I sound confusing on that, but I'm just trying to get it to be consistent. Any questions, or have I confused you completely on that? Okay. 21.4G. This misuse of authority section, I brought it up last week. I wondered whether it was redundant or not, or whether it added anything. And I think I'm retreating on that, because once you've got something in there, unless you define it completely, you can't take it out, because if you take it out, you may have the unintended effect of legitimizing the conduct that it prohibits, even if it's not well defined. So I still kind of struggle as to what it is. Go define an unwarranted privilege or exemption. Is there anybody who has a concern about this, or believes that it requires some further definition, or does anybody know what it means?
Yeah, I mean,
Go ahead, Brian.
oh, I was just gonna say it could be like a common example, like you get pulled over and you're like, oh, but I'm on this, and then the police officer is like, oh, I'll let you go. That's an unwarranted privilege. I think like that's favorable treatment. So I think that's a misuse of authority. I think it should be in there. I think it should be clear, and to make it clear, I have no idea how to do that, but I think it should stay in here.
Yeah, I agree. I think it should stay also. And I know it's undefined, Dan, and that's the problem you're having. And maybe what we add is, and this all is interpreted by the board, but maybe that to secure unwanted privileges or exemptions as determined by the board. And so it clearly establishes who's responsible for determining what was warranted or not warranted. And I know the board does it, but maybe that just makes it a little bit more clear.
Do we then call upon the board to start defining what unwarranted exemptions and privileges are?
If somebody makes a recommendation or makes a complaint, that's what they do anyway. I'm just offering that to make this section a little bit clearer. That's establishing exactly who's going to determine what's warranted or not.
By the Board of
Benefit.
Trustees?
Right?
Well, unless the Board of Trustees has a list of these,
I think that's impossible,
it is.
right? And so I think by just establishing that it is the Board of Ethics that's going to make that final determination, the reader of that section says, okay, that's their determination, their interpretation.
Yeah, all right, I think I'm inclined to,
But I think like we've been, like has been pointed out to us recently, the Board of Ethics makes a recommendation. They don't have a final decision. It's, the Board of Trustees or whatever further change we make or recommendation we make and that the Board of Trustees adopts will be the final arbiter of an issue. So, I think the ethics board, the misuse of authority, presumably they would have a list of, examples of misuse of authority. If somebody went to them and said, I believe that, can you tell me if this is a misuse of authority, or can you explain to me what a misuse of authority is? They would have to evaluate that and keep that as a part of their, their definitions and their training so that it's consistent. So,
or somebody could apply to the Board of Ethics for a formal opinion.
that's what I mean.
Yeah.
Whether it's a real issue or a hypothetical.
Right. Yeah, it's not in the model code or either of the model codes that I've read, but okay. By the way, I remembered the issue from last week. Nora sent me to John Mancini of the Conference of Mayors, which was a brilliant suggestion. And he came back to me like 5 minutes later. And I think I sent you the reply indicating that no, Board of Ethics can't suspend an elected official.
Yep.
So I think we're done on that issue. He's a great resource. He came right back to me. Okay, let's move on. 21.7D. Is that where I am? No. Stop laughing at me.
Sorry. I didn't freeze then. I should have frozen so you couldn't hear me laugh.
Yes, you should have frozen. Tell me if I've captured the language we were aiming at for 27D2. I think that's what we agreed to. No ethics board members shall be employed by or appear as part of their employment before the Village of Mamaroneck, the Town of Rye, or the Town of Mamaroneck. Is that what we were trying to achieve? Got appear in there twice. Do I take that as a yes?
Yeah, I think that's what we were getting at.
I'm sorry, I kind of like the word lobbyist, to be honest, because like if you appear like before, I don't know, the Board of Trustees and you're not asking for anything, you're like, oh, there's this community event I'm working for or something. Oh, I don't know. I just think you can appear before a board and not ask for anything, if that makes sense.
As part of their employment. So your problem was with appear.
Yeah, like you can go to before board and not ask for anything and just like want to talk to them.
Yeah.
I'm sorry if I'm not explaining.
But I mean, you're not saying as part of their employment there.
No, it is part of their employment, but or
No, if somebody's a if somebody is a member of a neighborhood association and they're also on the ethics board and they appear before the board of trustees to ask for a road to be shut down.
well, that's asking for something. But if like someone's like I don't know works in a store and they're on the board of ethics and they go to the board of trustees like, hey, we want to, I don't know, thank you for the welcome to our community, to the community or something. Like I think that's fine.
Right, so,
Like I've appeared before the board of trustees to like remind them about like parking signs. I didn't ask for anything. I was reminding people to like move their cars.
Not part of your employment, though.
I mean, it was on the traffic committee, so but that's not employment.
but it's not your employment. So I appeared before the board many years ago when we started the block parties. A friend of mine and I, we formed a not-for-profit, and we were the block parties started for raising money for local charities.
Mhm.
I don't think you can prevent residents from appearing before, appearing before boards and committees, unreasonably. You can't.
Right. I think as part of your employment is the key word or words.
Right. I would say that presents a conflict where you would be presumably, if it would be required for you to appear in front of the Village of Mamaroneck or the Town of Rye or the Town of Mamaroneck as part of your job, then presumably you would not be an appropriate ethics board member because you may have conflicts.
Correct. But as an individual citizen doing something separate, I think you should be fine.
That's not prohibited by this section.
Right.
Right.
I think it's clear that
I think we're good with this.
Fine with it, I guess.
don't back down because if you feel very strongly about it, Brian, or what I would say, Brian, is if you feel strongly about it, come up with a wording that you feel would be satisfactory to you, and we'll talk about it.
No, I mean, I think it's good right now. Just maybe the as part of their employment thing is like not clear to me.
All right, so Brian, let me give you an example. So going back actually 10 years ago, I went before the board to ask to shut down Mamaroneck Avenue in the village to do block parties, to raise money for charities. It had nothing to do with my employment. It was me as a citizen trying to do something. So I really do think the employed word is key here.
Well, does the Code of Ethics define employment anywhere? Can it also include like unpaid employment?
Well, unpaid employment is any volunteer activity.
Remember,
So I volunteer for At Home on the Sound. So if I go before the board for At Home on the Sound, it's just, I don't know.
we're talking about a Board of Ethics member, not member of the general public.
I know.
I know, but if I'm on the Board of Ethics and I'm also a volunteer for At Home on the Sound, Are you saying I can't go before the board to ask for something for at home and sound?
But I think presumably somebody else should be the person, if you have dual roles and dual membership, and you're on the ethics board, and you are also on at home on the sound, and there is a request to be made of one of the village board, then somebody else should be making that request.
I agree.
Simple.
Yeah, I agree. I think once you're on the ethics board, you got to really restrict what you do with respect to official bodies in the village.
Then then point 2 does not cover that. Point 2 limits that to the employment piece.
I agree.
But my question is like, I don't think employment's defined anywhere. Couldn't that also be unpaid?
I think
Employment, like,
we go down a bit of a rabbit hole here, because you have, an individual who is on the ethics board who has made an application before the planning board should be allowed to make that application, right? I mean, how do you legally prevent somebody from making that application and appearing to defend it?
Well, then it's not part of their employment if they're going before.
No, but I mean, like we were just saying, somebody who's a volunteer in another organization coming and appearing before the Board of Trustees. Where do we divide things, and how do we split that hair?
And I go back to when we started the block parties, it was 2 of us. So there wasn't somebody else who could go present it.
Right.
Well, the more I think about it, the more I feel we're really trying to, what the code is really trying to prohibit here is someone who works is part of their paid job to go before the village and gain some advantage for their employer or their job while they are on the Board of Ethics.
And why can't we just say as part of their paid employment?
Or make it clearer. All right, let me work with that. We're closing in on the hours, so maybe we can just.
Can I just go to number 4 in this section?
Yeah.
So, some of the ethics boards, ethics laws for other communities have included people should be elective. One member should be an elected officer. Other people have said no. I mean, I don't know how people feel about that, but that does open up a can of, if you're an elective officer of the village of Mamaroneck, you have a whole different set of responsibilities about how meetings and documents can be handled. So
You were saying leave it as it is or change it some?
yeah, no, I mean, I think there had been some talk previously that people wanted an elective officer on the ethics board, or an appointed officer like a senior manager. I'm not sure about that. I think it's hard to put a senior manager in that position. It would have to be the most senior manager.
I have not detected, John, any strong sentiment among us as a committee for this, to change this.
Okay.
No, I mean, I think he was referring to other municipal codes that have an elected official on the Board of Ethics, which I'm personally against. I think it's a bad idea.
Yeah, I kind of agree with Brian, and I don't know if we would want to have an elected person. I know we're going to discuss it more. Just right now, it's not sitting right with me, and I would want to think about it.
I agree. I just think that, some of the other codes that we looked at, some of our neighbors have an elected official on their ethics board.
Okay. I think we're agreed on that.
Okay.
Let me go to 21D6. I made the notification. Nope. Before I do that, yeah. I've made the notification of change of registration 10 days from the date of change. I think we agreed on that.
Yep.
And on next, we're going to go to 2113E. And I've changed promptly to within 48 hours. I think we agreed on that. For notification by the Board of Ethics of a complaint made against the Board of Ethics or a member. And I've, in my notes to you, I stated, please review the 4 other uses of the term prompt in the code and advise if you think that these need attention as well. The term prompt does appear in the model code that I have frequently cited, the one drafted by Mr. Davies. So it's not as if it's a void for vagueness term that does not appear anywhere else. It does. So my request to you is, obviously you can put in a word search and see if you have any objection or you think that use of the word prompt otherwise should be changed in the code. In preparing these notes, did not think it was so vital to cite each of those sections and enter into a discussion. I thought it was sufficient to ask you guys to take a look at it, which I hope you will do, unless you have already. 2113F, I have reworded this provision for clarity to provide that the Board of Trustees may appoint a designee to conduct the investigation. I think that came out of my copy's suggestion, and I think it's a very good one. And let me say at this point too, that we have recommendations from Mark Ettinger and we have recommendations from Tom Murphy. What I'd like to do is go through the sections as I've laid them out in my notes, and then go back and review Mark's recommendations and Tom Murphy's very strong request that the mayor not be put in the situation he was put in before, and we can address how that is covered. So this takes us, and I realize we're a couple of minutes past the hour, so I'm only gonna, you can just bear with us for just a moment to go to 2114B. This may be where, actually, this may be where we should stop. Because we were in a discussion last week about whether, on the subject of fines, whether they should be higher, lower, and I think we didn't get very far. And this might not be the best time to discuss that.
Just going to that number, the 1,500 number that's in there, is
Yeah.
that carried over from the state law?
I don't know.
I think that from what I recall, that was the state law number.
Whatever we do with the number, whatever number we land on, maybe we should add a section to that number should be reviewed on a 5-year or 10-year basis. Right? So if this stays in place for a long period of time, for me, $1,500 is trivial. Not that it's a little amount of money, but just in terms of what's at stake with some of the decisions that are made, it's not that much.
Yeah, I'm strongly feel we should raise it, but let's table that discussion for now. We're going to meet in 2 weeks. I will ask you, please, to review the notes that I sent you. I have suggested that we adopt some new definitions which come out of the model code. I think they would be helpful in the new code. And also think in terms of any sections that we've passed over that you think are important and need to be addressed. Are there any other subject matters, any other topics we should cover before we adjourn?
No, but no new topics, but what I will do over the next 2 weeks is go through, some of it's already in the racing matrix. But I'll just go through where we are now to see what we want to put on the village manager or what already existed, so we can have a meeting with Jerry and make sure he's on board.
Okay.
And also, you asked me to research the statute of limitations
Yes.
thing, and I couldn't really find anything on it, but I'll try again. 'Cause
Okay.
I think there's nothing on it that I might think, if I can't find anything on it, I think that might maybe invite us to entertain something regarding it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Might include something in the code of ethics.
Okay, good. Any other subject we need to cover for this evening? If not, is there a motion to adjourn?
I make a motion to adjourn.
Second?
Second.
I love that reluctance. It means you guys want to keep talking.
Oh, let's go.
All in favor, please signify.
Aye.
Motion is carried. We're adjourned. Thank you all very, very much. And have a wonderful 2 weeks. And we'll communicate via email, and be safe and stay safe and stay well.
Have a great night.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.